From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm Anne McLean from the library's music division. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by the culture critic and journalist Greil Marcus, titled Sam McGee's Railroad Blues and Other Versions of the Republic. This event is co-sponsored by the music division and the American Folklife Center, and we'd like to thank Peggy Bulger, Nancy Gross, and Todd Harvey particularly. We're delighted to be partnering tonight in presenting Mr. Marcus, a distinguished scholar of American popular music. He's admired for creative examinations and poetic associations linking rock and roll to political and social theory. Today, the City Paper described him as a unique cultural academic, rock critic, and Dylan scholar who's taught at Princeton, Berkeley, and currently New York's New School. Many of you are probably familiar with his books, including When That Rough God Goes Riding on Van Morrison, The Old Weird America, The Shape of Things to Come, Mystery Train, Dead Elvis, and Lipstick Traces, and a remarkable Dylan book you might know, Like a Rolling Stone. I'm very glad to say that tonight he'll be signing copies of his newest book on Bob Dylan, which officially won't be released until Monday, so that's kind of nice, following tonight's lecture. Please welcome Greil Marcus.
Thank you, Anne. And I thank Anne and Todd Harvey, Nancy Gross for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here, and I thank you for all for coming. In 1964, a man named Sam McGee made a new version of a tune he'd first recorded in 1934, Railroad Blues. And in the way that McGee's guitar seemed to have 20 strings, and McGee himself 4 hands, he was a whole orchestra. In the way that he shouted wahoo as his notes rushed past, in the way that he aimed his voice at the sky, he was standing by himself on top of a mountain, alone in the world, not another sign of human presence as far as he could see. But whatever image came to mind as McGee's Railroad Blues played, you couldn't imagine the man who was singing standing still. As the tune played, the singer went from one place to another, and he was no longer merely Sam McGee. From the first move into the tune, an almost unbearably delicious downward swoop on a fat bass note, making you feel as if you were being lifted off your feet. From that first gesture, whoever was singing and playing this song was somebody bigger, somebody more various than could ever be contained in an ordinary name. He was Daniel Boone with faster feet. He was Johnny Appleseed with songs instead of pips. He was Cooper's Leatherstocking with a sense of humor. He was Huck Finn as an old man, having long since understood, as Edmund Wilson wrote in 1922, for what drama his setting was the setting. The drama was to make a sound that would prove to all the world that the world remained to be found, even made. Went to the depot, looked up on the board, McGee sang for a first verse, he taking a commonplace line and throwing it away, out of the way of the story that he was telling on his guitar. Went to the depot, looked up on the board, went to the depot, looked up on the board. It said, good times here, but better up the road. Let's listen to Sam McGee's Railroad Blues.
Went to the depot, looked up on the board. Went to the depot, I looked up on the board. It read good times here, but better down the road. sure go carry. Well, you can't do me like you done poor Shine. You can't do me like you done poor Shine. You took poor Shine, woman, but you sure can't take mine. Lord, no. Here come me poor Bailey now. Static on. I met a little gypsy in a fortune-telling place. I met a little gypsy in a fortune-telling place. She read my mind, then she slapped my face. Woo!
Now, whoever's playing, in an instant, you can see him standing on a table in a bar full of drunks, and then you can see him in a concert hall, dashing back and forth from one side of the stage to the other as an audience of respectful folk revivalists sit thrilled and confused. You can glimpse a man walking into a barber shop looking for change, filling his hat, and then tossing the coins back at the rounders in the place, like Levon Helm and the bands up on Cripple Creek, telling the tale of what his Bessie did with her half of their racetrack winnings, tore it up and threw it in my face, just for a laugh. Who is this man? Not Sam McGee, but the figure who comes to life as Sam McGee plays. He's one of many figures who appear in American vernacular music as it was recorded in the 1920s and 30s. People who appear with such force and such charm, such a broad smile or an implacable scowl as to claim the whole of the country's story as if it was his or hers alone. It's incontestable, for example, that there's no room for the creature running through railroad blues in the nation established by Bella Lamb and his Greene County Singers, as they recorded in Richmond, Virginia, when OK Records held a joint recording session there in 1929, a recording session that featured as well the Monarch Jubilee Quartet, the Roanoke Jug Band, the Tub-Size Hawaiian Orchestra, the Bubbling Over Five, and 8 other acts. Bella Lamb, Xander von Obadiah Lamb, was born around 1870, and he died in 1944. He was a big man with a huge handlebar mustache. The Greene County Singers were Lamb, his wife Rose, their son Alva, Rose's brother Paul. In 1927, in New York, they recorded a profoundly peaceful version of See That My Grave Is Kept Green, an old song about the countless unmarked graves from the Civil War that later found its way into Blind Lemon Jefferson's See That My Grave Is Kept Clean. In 1929 in Richmond, though, the Sylvan Glade was nowhere in evidence. Bizarrely atonal banjo and guitar clang unpleasantly into even uglier singing, into nothing that can be called a rhythm or even a melody, but rather a translation into music of a conviction so murderously complete, so uninterested in what you think you believe, that suddenly you feel very small, on the outside of a story that's yours whether you want it or not. The story of Jesus Christ, your Savior, come to take you in the person of the Greene County Singers. And let's hear the Greene County Singers.
earthquakes may be hurled, and the moon may send a warning that tonight will end the world. If tonight should end the world, should end the world. If tonight should end the world, would your soul adrift be driven, or would you set sail for heaven? If tonight should end the world.
If tonight should end the world is the sound of people rooted to their ground, certain that no merely human force could move them an inch. It's a procession of singers stumbling down the street, stumbling because they can't keep time, because their harmonies are as arthritic as their hands must be, if their quacked and quivering voices are any clue to their age. But the music builds on itself until you too are waiting for the end of the world. If tonight should end the world, then what? They know. You don't. It isn't that the faithful if tonight should end the world, would turn away from the man in Railroad Blues as a sinner, or that they would turn him away from their church. They don't recognize him. He doesn't exist. They're people who move into the settlement that the railroad bluesman has just left, working hard, looking straight ahead, raising their church, building the town, so that when the man blows back into the place in a year or so, he won't even recognize it. To the Greene County singers, free in the embrace of the Lord, the man speaking in Railroad Blues is no more a prisoner of his own animal, is no more than a prisoner of his own animal appetites. And against people like him, their town doesn't even need a jail. Bella Lamb's banjo picks out "Crown Him, Lord Above," and you can feel that he and the rest of the Greene County singers are already in another world, even as they claim all rights to this one. And in the same way, it's hard to imagine the free American in Railroad Blues countenancing the destroyed individual in Emery Arthur's Man of Constant Sorrow from 1928. It's not today an obscure song. Bob Dylan recorded a version of it for his first album in 1962. And as the Maid of Constant Sorrow, Judy Collins sang it with pseudo-Elizabethan preciousness, the height of the folk revival. The Stanley Brothers recorded it, many more. In 2001, the Coen Brothers film, in the Coen Brothers film, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" George Clooney, John Turturro, Tim Blake Nelson, and Chris Thomas King, for a moment, the Soggy Bottom Boys, with Dan Tyminski of Alison Krauss's band, the voice behind George Clooney's dashing mic work. They swept the movie south with this song, and you didn't doubt for a minute that everyone there wanted to hear it more than they wanted to hear anything else. Let's listen to the Soggy Bottom Boys.
In constant sorrow all through his days, I am a man of constant sorrow. I've seen trouble all my days. I bid farewell to old Kentucky, the place where I was born and raised, the place where he was born and raised.
But Emery Arthur, who in 1929 accompanied the Virginia banjoist Doc Boggs on guitar, who Boggs recalled had been shot through the hands. He couldn't reach the chords. Bullets went through his hands. He was the first person to record Man of Constant Sorrow. Now you just say the first lines of the song. I am a man of constant sorrow. I've seen trouble all my days. Those lines are instantly, overwhelmingly sentimental. And unless you completely ignore the lines as you sing, as the Soggy Bottom Boys do, and the going for speed and flash, those lines are impossible not to dramatize. As Bob Dylan and Judy Collins found, the more quietly you sing those words, the the louder they become. And the more of a poseur, the more of a fake they reveal you to be. But Emery Arthur bangs on his guitar as if he's been shot through the hands. You can almost see the bones sticking out. Plink, plink, he says, and he says it no more musically than Bella Lamb's band. I am a man of constant sorrow, he says plainly, as if he were saying, I'm hungry or I'm cold, as if he's learned to say such things with dignity. I have seen trouble all my days. It's that have, I have seen trouble, instead of the usual contraction of I've seen trouble, that says what the singer is saying isn't obvious, it isn't common, it's not something you really want to hear about. So this is Emery Arthur, Man of Constant Sorrow.
The place where I was born and raised. Oh, for 6 long years I've been in trouble. My pleasure here on earth is done. For in this world I have to ramble. I have no friends to help me now. Oh, fare you well, my own true lover. I fear I'll never see you again. For I am bound to ride the Northern Railroad. Perhaps I'll die up on the train. Oh, you can bury me in some deep valley. For many years there I may lay. And while you're dreaming, while you're slumbering, while I am sleeping in the clay, oh, it's fare you well to my native country, the place where I have loved so well. For I have had all kinds of trouble in this vain world, no tongue can tell. But friends, although I may be a stranger, my face you may never see no more. But there's one promise that's been given, where we can meet on a beautiful shore.
Now you can imagine the Greene County singers trying to pull Emery Arthur into their fold. They'd recognize him, if only because they speak the same blank language. The Greene County singers singing as if they don't care if you hear them, even though their records and Emery Arthur's records, these weren't field recordings, these weren't taken down by folklorists, these were recorded for commercial record companies with the idea that people would buy them. But the Greene County singers sound as if they don't care if you hear them. And Emery Arthur sings as if he can't believe that anyone would ever listen to him. But why would the man in Railroad Blues even pause? In his thin voice, which imperceptibly moves from bitterness to acceptance, from anger to peace, the figure in Man of Constant Sorrow offers a kind of challenge, a rebuke to God's gifts. And it's this that will keep him out of Bella Lamb's church. After a verse or two, the tunelessness of Emery Arthur's performance settles into a hurdy-gurdy beat, and you're no longer afraid of the singer. He's put you at ease so he can put you on the spot, so he can show you how absolutely you will never know him. Oh, you can bury me in some deep valley. For many years there I will lay. And when you're dreaming, while you're sleeping, while I am sleeping in the clay. It's the irreducible individualism of the details that rarely, if ever, moved into other versions of the song, the already traditional song, perhaps because they communicate as so specific to a particular individual that to appropriate them would be a kind of theft that the folk process couldn't even excuse. It's those details that seal the bottomless well of this song. The unusual reference to dreaming, the use of clay, not just ground. The singer goes on after this verse, not in death, but relating more of his travail, but he doesn't need to. Like the Greene County singers with If Tonight Should End the World, he's told a finished story, and having done so, he's delivered a finished verdict in his words, "In my own true country, the land that I have loved so well. If that nation, as it's been composed into a republic, of which the singer is a citizen, has cast him out, then the country is a fiction, and there's no home for anyone, or ought not to be." Born in 1900 in Wayne County, Kentucky, Emory Arthur died in 1966 in Indianapolis. And he likely wouldn't have recognized, or maybe wouldn't have deigned to recognize, the Bob Dylan who recorded Man of Constant Sorrow in 1962. But he would have recognized the very old song, When First Unto This Country, as Bob Dylan sang it in 1997. Whether he would have recognized or accepted the majesty that Dylan brought to a song as bereft as his own, I have no idea. Starting in the mid-1980s, Dylan, playing by himself with acoustic guitar and harmonica, and then later with a band, began working more and more traditional material into his concerts, old songs about knights and damsels and sailors and buffalo skinners, and all sung without a trace of irony or doubt, just an awareness of one's own smallness in the face of the enormity of these figures. Many of these songs were collected on the insanely rigorous 9-CD bootleg, the Genuine Never-Ending Tour, the Covers Collection, 1988 to 2000, which presented Dylan's concert performances of songs by others organized into different discs for country and soul and rhythm and blues and folk songs and traditional blues and pop and on, right down to alternates and retakes, more versions of songs already appearing on all the other discs. One last, obviously redundant piece of plastic meant to squeeze another $30 or so out of anyone crazy enough to even think about buying this thing. But on this last disc, alternates and retakes, that's where the action was. The first 8 CDs make an enormous colorless lump. And in the last one, with every genre mixed up, everything is alive. And here you find the version of When First Unto This Country that sticks. When first unto this country, a stranger I came. You can't say more. You can't over-dramatize those lines. That's the whole story of the country. Surely as a TV guide summary of the film of Moby Dick I once saw was the whole story of the country. A mad captain enlists others in his quest to kill a white whale. Dylan takes all the drama the song has. An electric guitar finds the hesitation in the melody, in the bass notes, and it plays an actual overture. And a wash of cymbal noise is like a wave lapping at the side of a ship, and a muffled thump from the bass drum lets you feel the singer step ashore. and then everything slows down, as if before the story has even begun. You have to hear the ending, and you do. The theme has been stated, and it's elegant, and it's fine, and it's beautiful in the way that you can imagine the ruins of a Greek temple are more beautiful than the actual complete building could ever have been. A second electric guitar turns the melody into a count, and as the singer walks into America, his steps are measured. And let's listen to that for a moment.
To this country, the stranger I came. I courted a fair maid, Nancy was her name.
The singer courts Nancy, her love I didn't obtain, for reasons that he never gives, out of rage, out of a will to self-destruction, out of a sense of irredeemable estrangement from the land and the people who already claim to belong. He steals a horse, and he's captured, and his head is shaved. He's beaten. He's thrown into prison and forgotten. I wished I'd never been a thief, he says, tearing the words out of his throat. It's so painful you might imagine the man finally free after 5 years, maybe 10 years. But the pain in the man's voice is its own prison. And so you can imagine him moving from town to town, bar to bar, trying to find somebody to listen to him, to listen to his story, to listen to his song. And he repeats the first lines of the song over and over again. And now, with the finished story weighing down on every word, the first lines, not just of the song, but the first lines of the country. Now, all these people, the happy man in Railroad Blues, and the saved in If Tonight Should Save the World, the dead man in Man of Constant Sorrow, and the walking dead man in When First Unto This Country, they're all separates from each other. They're isolados, in Melville's word from Moby Dick. There's miles and miles between the church and this congregation of Ishmaels. Good times here, but better down the road, the man in Railroad Blues says with every note. Neither the Emery Arthur in Man of Constant Sorrow or the Bob Dylan in When First Unto This Country would hear that man any more than Bella Lamb would suffer to listen to him. What these songs, what these performances say is plain. If this is a republic, it's fated to scatter. It was made to guarantee its citizens the freedom that was theirs by right, not to limit it. Everybody understands this, and that's the rub. Within the boundaries of that freedom, anything can happen and everything will. If this is one republic, nobody can see it whole, and only the bravest can even think about it. Now, when Sam McGee first recorded Railroad Blues in 1934, he was just then stepping out of a hole that had opened up in the story of American vernacular music, or folk music. Hundreds of people had come forth to tell that story in the 1920s, when early in the decade it became clear to northern record companies that they were paying audiences for the kind of music that these people already knew. Stuff they could hear on a neighbor's front porch, in the barrel house, for blues, for ballads, for folk lyric hybrids of the two, for sounds that carried novelty, for sounds that were already called old-time music. So from all over the South, from Texas, New Orleans, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, an America that had hidden in folk tales and the unwritten journals of the wanderings of the first generation of African Americans to be born out of slavery. This America emerged from the shadows of family memory and solitary meditation. That America took the form of many bodies: prophet, trickster, laborer, gambler, whore, preacher, thief, penitent, killer, dead woman, dead man. But the queer thing about this country was that this country was seen and heard almost exclusively by people who already lived in it. In other words, the records that were made were sent right back down to where they came from and nowhere else. Nowhere else, with some exceptions that I'll get to. People bought records that reminded them of themselves, that gave them proof of their existence, that raised their existence from the level of subsistence into a heaven of representation. And then came the Depression, and the music market collapsed. Communities that had harbored the stories the nation at large still had no time for collapsed in its wake. Subsistence was no longer a matter of the boredom of one day following another, one indistinguishable day following another, but it was a real drama. And in this squalid tragedy, a father spending a family's last dollar on a phonograph record would have been a horror story. So record companies recalled their scouts, they cleared their catalogs, and they closed their recording facilities. By 1934, when Sam McGee first recorded Railroad Blues, businesses had begun to reorganize, and not because the economy had come back to life, but because people looked out at the ruins of their society and they discovered with a shock that they weren't dead. When the recording of white and black folk music, much of it traditional, authorless, and commonplace, much of it composed, little of it copyrighted, most of it entering the public domain as if it had been there forever, when the recording of this music began, again, it was on a much more rational basis than had happened in the 1920s. Instead of the open auditions where oddballs and families appeared in their strange clothes with Sears catalog instruments and their neighbors' or their grandparents' songs, professionals were now favored. And instead of music that everybody knew and anybody could play, record companies looked for virtuosity, for music that only a few people could make. And this is where the first Railroad Blues comes from. Born in 1894, Sam McGee lived until 1975, when he was killed in a tractor accident. And he played and recorded for years with the great banjoist Uncle Dave Macon of the Grand Ole Opry. Sam McGee could play anything, and when he recorded Railroad Blues in 1934, he sounded as if he were in a cutting contest with himself, as if he were not one but two guitarists, as if the two of them facing off against each other like duelists. And it's brilliant the way an instrumental phrase goes up and down like a yo-yo and then slips right back up. Now you see it, now you don't. But there's something missing, something only the version that McGee recorded precisely 30 years later reveals. The 1934 version of Railroad Blues puts the spotlight on the performer, the fastest gunslinger in town. But by 1964, something closer to what happened when vernacular music was recorded in the 20s was taking place. Many of the people who made that music were different from the people around them. They had more nerve. They were less afraid of the shame of failure. They had a deeper belief in themselves. They took greater risks. The risk of appearing before a businessman in a suit who more than likely would send you away as if you were no better than anybody else. The critic Robert Christgau writes tellingly about Doc Boggs. Boggs passing an audition in his hometown of Norton, Virginia in 1927, and then traveling to New York to record his scary and damned songs about death, but so full of beans at the chance that he's gotten that he can barely contain not his rage, not his resentment, not his sense of exclusion, his fear of embarrassing himself in front of New York sharpies. What he can't contain is his joy that he's getting this chance. And you can hear the like of this all through the generic but also unique discs that Harry Smith compiled in 1952 for the anthology that at first he just called flatly American Folk Music. The thrill at the chance to speak, even only as a faraway premise, to speak one's piece to the whole country, even the world at large, because the Sears catalog not only sold instruments, it sold records by Doc Boggs, it sold records by Sam McGee in Singapore, in Tierra del Fuego, in Barcelona, in Japan, in Turkey. The thrill to speak to the country, the thrill to imagine that you could speak to the whole world, had to be at the root of the peculiar spell that those records cast in 1952 for Harry Smith and all those who heard them, and the same spell that those records cast now. When in the 60s, folk revivalists sat before such 1920s and 1930s heroes as Mississippi John Hurt, Clarence Ashley, Doc Boggs, Buell Kazee, Skip James, or Son House, they might have celebrated them as representatives of the people, of the folk, as the folk musicians of the folk. But as they listened and as they watched, as they were thrilled, they may have been responding less to what made these musicians part of the folk than what set them apart from the folk. Their ambition, their inner drive, their inability to tolerate their fellow human beings. But the music is nothing if not a mystery. And a mystery that occurs when a version of the nation's story, that has been excluded from the story as it's officially told, is suddenly offered to the public. That's what happened in the 1920s when Southern musicians produced their version of America, and taken together, they argued for a more contingent life, a less absolute death, an America where nothing was impossible and no settlement was ever final. And in this mystery, the radical individualism that you can hear in 20s folk music is always questioned, and it's questioned by the same voice. One of the most shadowy features of the music, one of the most queer, is the element of anonymity, the way the performer seems to step back from himself or herself, back into the community of which the performer is a part, or if the performer is not part of a community, or sounded as if he or she couldn't be, the anonymity of the way the performer seemed to slip back into the oblivion where he or she lived alone, like Paul Muni stepping back from the camera and into darkness at the end of I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. How do you live, he's asked. I steal, he says. When the tension between the self-presentation of the artist and the anonymous, even seemingly bodiless being behind the artist comes into a verge, the result is something no less exciting and no less unsettling than the appearance of the radical individual. And this is what I think is happening in Sam McGee's Railroad Blues as he recorded it in 1964. This is no longer the experienced sideman stepping out to claim his own career, to record under his own name, to show off all the tricks in his bag. Something bigger is happening. And in a country with more room in it than the country present in the 1934 version, a country with more room in it comes into view. And you're hearing someone who's seen all around the country, its past, its future, and he's made a remarkable discovery. America has never changed, and it never will. In the version of the Republic that's enacted in Railroad Blues in 1964, nothing matters but movement. How you move, how you carry yourself, the promises you make in your very demeanor, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way your clothes fit, the way your expression fits your face, the way your face somehow changes everything you see. The specter in the music emerges immediately, the pioneer, the wanderer. And in his freedom, he threatens those who stay home, working, saving, hoping, frightened. but he also leaves a blessing. Without living his life, you're allowed to know how it feels. So it's no longer Sam McGee, but a kind of abstraction who offers Railroad Blues in 1964, or in 2002, 27 years later, on a Smithsonian Folkways collection called Classic Mountain Songs, which is where I first heard Railroad Blues. When McGee recorded in 1934, that signpost that appears in the beginning of the song was crucial, the kickoff to the record. Went to the depot, looked up on the board. It said, "Good times here, but better down the road." In 1934, that was a direct and political statement. It had to be said. In 1934, in the ditch of the Depression, it was the last thing anybody could take for granted if they could believe it at all. Better times down the road? Good times here? The same words are said in 1964. They're tossed off. But as an event in the music, they've already happened. You've already heard it. You've already felt it. That swoop, that astonishing lift, that fat note breaking into 1,000 glittering fragments as the strings shake, have already called the train before the man gets a word out of his mouth. Those high notes are no longer a performer's calling card. They have a life of their own. Those notes are thinner with every measure. The way the note stretches out, all the way out, you can't believe that it's still hanging in the air. And the way a following note seems to just barely draw the breath of that first note and then continue the story. The bass note that says "not so fast," the notes shoot out into the air, they don't pay any attention to it. You're sure they're gone, and then they pick up again. That's what's uncanny. The sense that in the truest tales the country can tell about itself, those tales must be incomplete, just like that note stretching out, and never coming to an end. Those notes, the country story, has to hang in the air so that anybody can find it, so that anybody can take it out of the air. And that, finally, is what took place at the beginning of this story. A story about a certain historical emergence of certain versions of the American story. Now, there's one piece of music that I know that sees every Gothic, pious, drunken, murdering, thieving, loving figure moving through the old American music for who he or she is and embraces them all. And that song is Richard Rabbit Brown's James Alley Blues. Was recorded one day in 1927, the only day that Richard Brown ever recorded. And for me, that he recorded only once is like Melville not bothering to keep Hawthorne's letter about Moby Dick, the letter of which Melville could say, a sense of unspeakable security is in me because Hawthorne had, in Melville's unbearably direct words, understood the book. We'll never know what Hawthorne said. The smallest, most modest notes creep out of Brown's guitar like tadpoles, swimming in search of their melody, their rhythm, and a bass note gongs, shaking the air. Nothing is pressed. An old, ragged voice, sour, laughing at its own sourness, begins to tell a story about a marriage. And he snaps at his strings to drive a point home, but every time he does, that weird gonging is there, pulling the real story away from the story that's being told, pulling the story away, putting it in the air. This is James Alley Blues.
Nothing like they used to be. No times ain't now, nothing like they used to be. And I'm telling you all the truth, oh, take it for me. I done seen better days, but I ain't putting up with these. I done seen better days, but I'm putting up with these. I can have a much better time, but these girls now it's so hard to please. 'Cause I was born in the country, I'm easy to lose. 'Cause I was born in the country, she thinks I'm easy to lose. She tried to hitch me to a wagon, she wanna drive me like a mule. You know, I bought the groceries and I paid the rest. Yeah, I bought the groceries and I paid the rent. She tried to make me wash her clothes, but I got good common sense. I said, if you don't want me, why don't you tell me so? You know that if you don't want me, why don't you tell me so? Because it ain't like a man that ain't got nowhere to go. I'll even give you sugar for sugar, let you get salt for salt. I'll give you sugar for sugar, let you get salt for salt. And if you can't get along with me, well, it's your own fault. How you want me to love you and you treat me mean? How do you want me to love you? You keep on treating me mean. You're my daily thought and my nightly dream. Sometimes I think that you're too sweet to die. Sometimes I think that you're too sweet to die. And another time I think you ought to be buried alive.
When Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller produced The Drifters' There Goes My Baby in 1959, the first time anybody ever layered the equivalent of a complete symphony orchestra over a piece of rock and roll, the effect, they said, was like a radio dial caught between two different stations. You can imagine that Rabbit Brown's James Alley Blues could have had a similar effect on those few who heard it, except it would have been as if the performer existed between different eras, different lives, different ways of understanding the world, and like There Goes My Baby made you understand that the divisions between those things are meaningless. That was the meaning of that mystical gonging behind the prosaic facts that the singer was relating. That was the meaning of the small searching notes that shot out ahead of every theme, blindly seeking a destination that could never be named. It was those same tiny seeking notes that Sam McGee would seek out himself in 1934, but not truly recapture until 3 decades after that. He would from the start cast off the fatalism that Rabbit Brown's notes carried, the thick, fat notes that McGee would use to symbolize escape and liberation, that swoop, that up and down, that if you don't believe I'm leaving, you can count the days I'm gone. Notes that in James Alley Blues are filled up by Brown's echoing, flapping gongings, not warnings of what might happen, but portents of what will happen. In McGee's hands, those notes will no longer speak of death. And then If Tonight Should Save the World, Should End the World, Man of Constant Sorrow, and When First Into This Country, the singers value nothing so much as death. And James Alley Blues has room for them too. The small notes in James Alley Blues move like mice, scurrying from one room to another and never stopping, and the house only gets bigger as they move. The man singing James Alley Blues, and you have to imagine him small and wiry and wary, moving carefully, smiling, looking over his shoulder. The man singing James Alley Blues welcomes them all, and they enter his house because they sense that he knows more about death than they do. But that's not all Rabbit Brown knows. Railroad Blues is frank about the fact that it's made for pleasure. It's an argument that freedom is more pleasurable than death. If tonight should end the world, man of constant sorrow, and we're first into this country, are arguments that death is more meaningful than pleasure. Arguments that hide their power and passion, or the perfection of form, elements of performance that give pleasure because their beauty makes it seem as if their arguments are true. But Rabbit Brown knows something about pleasure that it seems nobody else does. He knows how to give pleasure as if it were the gift of a guardian angel. And what he leaves behind, the sense of a place so big that there's room for anyone, a place that's too big for anyone to escape, is exactly a story that can only start in the middle, with whoever telling it, like Sam McGee in the middle of Railroad Blues, Rabbit Brown in the middle of James Alley Blues, with whoever telling this story unsure if he should go forward or if he should go back. Thank you. Thank you. I'll have to ask somebody what time it is. Anybody has any questions, any arguments, disputes? I'd be happy to try and respond.
Hi, I was interested in hearing the Dylan version of When First Into This Country, which I've never heard, partly because what I hear in that jangling electric guitar at the beginning of it is an imitation of the auto harp of the New Law City Ramblers, who recorded that song. And we have a field recording here at the library, which I believe was the source of the New Law City Ramblers version. And I'm just wondering if those sort of specific histories of individual songs and performances touch on the sort of more general historical context of these songs that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, threads of scholarship, of the kind of knowledge that you're talking about, move all through this story, but secretly. Bob Dylan's knowledge of the kind of music that I was talking about tonight is enormous. And I mean knowledge of who recorded when and in what city and who was that person recording with and who was the engineer, that kind of knowledge. And so what you've just said, there's no way that he didn't know New Law City Ramblers version, and it's very, very likely that he knows the other version you're talking about too, and that all that goes in there. And it's a way of keeping the story going, of passing the baton from one person to another, but also changing it, because there is a different, because yes, the auto harp melody and even the orchestration is there in that guitar opening, and yet there's a different kind of drama. There's more glamour to it. There's more cinematic suspense. You know, it's in color. At least that's how I hear it. But you're completely right, that's all present. And you know, it's present all through. None of these people who I was talking about tonight were ignorant of what anybody else was doing. They were all listening. They're all in competition. They're all stealing from each other.
You kind of, at the end you finished with the Rabbit Brown or all the fellas, the story, it had to start in the middle, and the speaker didn't know, the singer didn't know if they should be or heading back or heading forward. So I wonder if you think Rabbit Brown knew just how powerful he was when he was recording that song, and the meaning that he was getting out of it, or is that something that comes later once the audience gets to hear it?
Well, look, here's a guy. He's a New Orleans street singer. He really supported himself by standing around Lake Pontchartrain and offering to serenade couples when they would take a boat out on Lake Pontchartrain. And can you imagine, you know, you're about to propose to someone, you think it'd be really romantic to go out on the lake, and wow, we'll get this guy to sing, and he'll sing something really lovely and create the mood, and he sings James Alley Blues. So here's this person, and he gets one chance to record, and nobody knows exactly when he was born. He died, I think, in 1935. And he gets one chance to record, and he can probably figure he's never going to get another chance. You know, maybe somebody told a record scout, you ought to hear this guy, or maybe somebody was hanging around the lake and heard him, gives him a chance to record for Victor, you know, for a major company. And this is his chance. This is his one chance. He records 5 songs that day. And this is his song. This is the one he's really worked on. This is the one he's crafted out of pieces of other old songs that he's put together in his own way. And then he's worked out an arrangement for, and he knows this is his chance to get it right. He's never going to get another chance. I think it's the greatest record ever made. And I don't say that as any kind of joke. From the time I first heard it, I thought, this must be. That was, let's see, that was 40 years ago. And I haven't heard anything better yet. So maybe so. Yeah, yeah. And so one other recording he made of several, of the 5, was a version of the Titanic. And it's a version of the Titanic unlike any I've ever heard. The words are completely conventional. The way he dramatizes them is not. You know, he says, you know, and this was happening, and oh my God, can you believe this? And have you heard? But this is a version of the Titanic that takes into itself the knowledge that everybody in the African American community knew, that the Titanic advertised itself not only as unsinkable, which is what's come down to us, but as all white. Not only were there no black people allowed as passengers, not only were there no black people employed as stewards or waiters in the dining rooms, they weren't even going to have black people in the boiler room, beneath the hold, nowhere. But there was one black person who stowed away on that ship, according to many versions of the song. And I won't go into what happens with him. The way Rabbit Brown sings the song of the Titanic, when he gets into Nearer My God Than Thee, the way he stretches out the line, he sings these lines with so much glee, with so much delight at all these people going down. It's really something. But it's not like this. It's not like this perfect record with these sounds unlike anybody had ever made. Well, I could go on, as you can tell.
What happened to the black stowaway?
Excuse me?
What happened to the black stowaway of the Titanic?
Well, he was the guy who got into a lifeboat, and he was sitting in that lifeboat, and he was looking up at all the women on the ship who began pulling up their dresses, saying, take me, I'll give you anything. And he just turned his back and went away. He was known as Shine in the song. Yeah.
I'm interested in this question or this statement that you made that a lot of these singers were invested with this kind of radical individualism. And if I heard you right, you said, if this is a republic, it is made to scatter. And that is so different than the folk music revival that was so invested in this sort of social collective and this idea of a republic, a different kind of republic that was based on those kind of ideals. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the tensions that were there between these people that were coming to perform at these folk festivals in Newport and whatnot, that were considered the folk by the folk movement revival, but perhaps were coming with, as you say, different ambitions and whatnot.
Well, I mean, it's a question of ideology, and it's a question of ideas that people bring to an event before they've experienced the event. An idea of somebody's identity that you already formed before you've ever met that person. And, you know, Mike Bloomfield described this maybe better than anybody. He said, Mance Lipscomb had played electric guitar for years in Texas, but when the people from the Newport Folk Festival brought him up, they made him leave his electric guitar behind. He said they treated him as if he was the tar baby, meaning just a figure from black folklore, not a real person who could make his own decisions about how he wanted to play and how he wanted to sound. He had to be brought forth as a representative of the folk, and the folk didn't play no electric guitar. That's the best way I can answer it, briefly.
So were there any tensions there in some of these things where they would, as being portrayed as sort of this other?
Yeah, I mean, there was tremendous tension. I mean, you take somebody like Clarence Ashley, somebody like Skip James, who were ordinary, disagreeable, proud people, and they were, you know, put in, you know, kind of musical forums where the whole point would be to illustrate a genre. And these people say, I'm not a genre, you know? I mean, this is what I have to say. This is my way of saying it. And, you know, there would be a lot of anger there, and sometimes it would come out, and sometimes it wouldn't. And often it would come out, though, in the performances that you saw, that one could see. Someone's going to have to tell me when I have to leave. Okay. If there is one more? I didn't mean to be intimidated.
Well, thank you very much all for coming. Thank you,
Thank
Greil
you.
Marcus,
Thank
very,
you
very
for
much.
coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.